Let's now take a look at JavaScript functions. A function is kind of like a task or a set of tasks grouped together. For example, in our upcoming Speedy Chef project, we will have many functions which perform a certain task, such as generating a new pizza. We'll have one for creating a new order, and also one to check if the oven is full. These functions can either run immediately or more often when we call them at a later stage. Just like arrays and objects, which we've looked at in the previous two videos, we will have a more detailed functions section coming up in the course, but for now having a basic function knowledge will really help us with some other steps. Also, just like these arrays and objects which we've just looked at, a function also falls into the same object type group too. For this lesson, head into the last folder inside of our JavaScript basics, and this is number 13, Introduction to Functions. Open this up and also in the browser too. What we're going to do is, first of all, we have two arrays just here which we can ignore, and we can go just below these. We'll come back to these in just a moment. For now though, we'll take a look at how a function works, and we begin by using the function keyword. The function keyword is then followed by a name which you want to give this function. So just like a variable above, we then assign a name, and for this example, let's go for random number. This is a name which we call the function by each time we want to run the code inside. Immediately after this name, we pass it in some brackets, which is called parentheses, and inside of these brackets, we can pass in some extra information to the function, but more on this in a moment. The last part of this type of function is the curly braces, and this is the function body. These braces inside of here contain all of the code which we want to run when we call this function by its name. These braces can also be thought of as a set of gates to contain all of the function code inside, and this is what is called a function declaration. Inside we can place in any code which we want to run. For now, let's place in a simple browser alert. Save this and over to the browser. If we refresh, we don't see this alert running inside of here. To actually run this code, just like we mentioned, we need to call the function by its name, followed by these brackets just here. So just below this, call our random number, add the brackets or these parentheses. This should now call our function code, and then display the alert inside the browser. Another good example of a function would be a calculator to convert a dog age to a human age. So let's start again. We'll go back to our original function keyword, and this time we'll call this dog to human. Add the brackets or the parentheses, and then the function body. Just above, create a new variable which is going to be our dog age, and let's set this to any value such as 3. We can then access this variable inside of our function, and then do a multiplication to convert this to human years. To access this variable, all we need to do is to access it by its name, so the dog age, and then multiply this value to 7 to give us the human years. And we can also store this inside of a constant. Let's go for human equiv. So for now, looking at this function, all this is doing is grabbing our dog age variable and multiplying this by 7. But we also need to tell the function to actually send back this new value. And the way to do this is to use the return keyword, and we can return our human equiv variable. Just like before, we then call this function, which was the dog to human. And if we save this and over to the browser, refresh, we don't see anything different inside the browser. We don't see anything different because in the first function we looked at, it contained an alert. So this was a visual cue that the function was running. But for this one, we don't have an alert, we don't have a console log, we're not setting a level 1 heading with the inner text. All we're doing is returning back a value. So to actually use this value, we could, if we wanted to, we could grab this inside of a console log and see the returned value inside the console. Or more commonly, we could store this inside of a constant called result. And this result will then contain this returned value, which is the dog age multiplied by 7. If we wanted to, we could do a simple console log with the value of the result. But let's go one step further and convert this into a string. If we use the backticks, we can also make use of this result variable, and we'll say my dog is aged. And remember to pass in a variable, we use the dollar symbol, the curly braces, and then insert the variable name, and then continue the string to say in human years. So this should say my dog is aged, and in our case this would be 21 in human years. Over to the browser and open up the console, refresh the page, and there we go, there's our new string with the variable contained inside. So just to recap, we've created a function. This function is going to access our dog age variable of 3, multiply it by 7, we then store this inside of a variable, and then return this result back from the function. We then call this function below and store this returned value inside of our result. Result can then be used anywhere inside of our code, such as just here when we insert it inside of a string. Also, do be aware that this return keyword should only be used once inside of a function, since it signals that the function should stop running. There are, however, some exceptions, such as when using this inside of an if-else statement, which we'll learn about later. But generally, return is the end of the function, and any code which we place after it will be ignored. We can see this if we add an alert, and then run this in the browser. Refresh the page and we see our console log, but we don't see any alert on the page because this falls after our return statement. So this effectively ends our function. Let's remove this. So at the beginning of this video, we mentioned that these brackets, just after the function name, we can also pass in extra information to this function. In the brackets, we set up one or more parameters, which you can think of as variables. So instead of our dog age, just above, we can comment this out. We can pass in a variable or a parameter called dog age directly into our function. We can also pass in multiple values separated by a comma, and then we can access this inside of our function just like before. But this dog age had a value of 3 assigned to it. So how do we actually pass this value to this parameter? Well, we do this when we actually call the function just here. Let's go for a different example, this time of 5. And this actual value which we pass when we call the function is called an argument. You don't need to remember this at the moment, but this is an argument and this is a parameter. Let's try this out. Give this a save and over to the browser. And now we see the different value of 35 inside of our log. As we've gone through this video, there has been a few keywords involved, and you don't need to remember all of these at this stage. People do often confuse parameters and arguments, and also use them interchangeably. It's not a huge problem, but just to clarify, a parameter is the variable or the placeholder inside of our function declaration. And we can then access them inside of our function body, which is inside of the curly braces. We then have arguments, which are the actual values we pass in when we call this function, such as our number in this example. Let's take this a little bit further by using our 2 arrays at the very top. Let's clean this up, remove all of this function code. And we're now going to make a function which is going to check for any allergies inside of these recipes. So the function will take in the recipe such as bread and brownies, and then we can also pass in a particular ingredient which a person is allergic to. The function will then loop through all of these values and check if this is contained inside the recipe. So just like before, create our function, give this a name of check allergies, the parentheses, and then the curly braces. So for this function to work correctly, it needs to take in 2 things. First of all, the actual recipe to check against. So we'll call this the recipe parameter, and separated by a comma, it also needs to be passed a certain ingredient to check if it's contained inside. Open up the function body, and the first step is to access our recipe, which is either the bread or the brownies array. Since this is an array, we can then make use of the includes method. We did quickly take a look at the includes method earlier, and this will check if a certain value is contained inside of this array, and then return a true or false value. And we want to check if this ingredient is contained, which is passed as a parameter. So although we have these variables, we have the recipe and the ingredient, this is exactly the same as if we were to access our bread array just above, and then call the includes method just like this. And then we could check if the flower is contained inside. If it is, which is the case here, this would then return the value of true. If it wasn't found inside of the array, we will get back the value of false. So both of these lines of code do exactly the same. The difference is we can pass in different values to our function. Next, store this inside of a constant called hasIngredient. So this should only ever be true or false, and then we can return this back from our function. To see this return value, we can create a console log. Then inside of here, call our function, which is called checkAllergies. Add the brackets or the parentheses, and then we need to pass in two arguments. First of all, the recipe, which is either the bread or the brownies. Let's go for bread. And then pass in our ingredient, which we want to check if it's contained inside of this recipe. Let's go for flour. We know this is contained inside of bread, so this should return a value of true. Let's save this and refresh the browser, and then we'll see our value inside the console. Let's try a false value, so we'll go for eggs. This is false, but we know eggs is contained inside of brownies. Let's try this one, and this should once again be a value of true. So just as a recap, if this is all a bit much at the moment, we are creating a function called checkAllergies, where we're going to check if an ingredient is contained inside of a recipe. We then access this recipe, which is either the bread or the brownies, and we check if it includes this particular ingredient. If it does, this will return back a true value. If it doesn't, it will return false, which will then display inside of the logs. And hopefully you should be starting to see the power of functions, but there is a lot more to functions which we'll soon discover. One of the big benefits of functions is they are reusable. If we have code in our programs which was repeated multiple times, we could grab all of that code and move it into a standalone function, and then call the function in place of this code. The function can also be passed different values in the form of arguments, which we've just discovered here. And you can also think of a function as kind of like a building block for our program too. Each one is assigned a particular task, so we can make our code more organized. Functions can also be in many other forms too. This example here is a more traditional form of a JavaScript function, and there are other types available too, such as an arrow function, which we will cover later on. As a general guide though, if possible, it is beneficial to try and keep our functions as small as possible and only focusing on one task. This makes it much easier to know what a function is doing, makes it more reusable, and it also helps with debugging because if there is an issue, we can focus down this problem onto one particular function, so it's much easier to find.